Well, I think the issues, it's a very interesting forum. I think that it has covered quite a few different issues, but I think there are other issues that could be looked at. Partly that this forum is titled International Assessments and the Convergence of Education Reforms. So it already kind of pared down the kind of issues that people looked at. And when they use the word international assessments, they're primarily referring to the big international learning tests, the PISA and the TIMSS and the PEARLs. And the convergence is also in a very particular area of kind of theoretical discourse in the field of the social sciences of education or in comparative education. So for me, based at UNESCO and doing work around learning assessments, I think that there are many issues that have to do with what's happening in countries outside of the global north, in other parts of the world that are also struggling with trying to find ways to measure and monitor the kinds of learning that their students are acquiring, what kinds of skills, what kinds of knowledge, what kinds of attitudes, what kinds of worldviews. And often they're doing this not by participating in the big international assessment exercises, but at the national level, using various kinds of resources that they have available, or at the regional level. And so my sense is that there's a whole different series of issues that are related to national learning assessments and regional learning assessments that are not being covered as much in this particular forum. So I would hope that since the stage or the framework or the academic field of that examines learning assessments and testing more generally, kind of from a global perspective, that they would take on the enormous new initiatives that one finds at all these different levels, and also focus their attention on those to the same extent that they are taking on the big international assessments. And partly it's also that there's a certain, how should we say, bias to go after the big players that are wielding enormous power, economic resources that are being mobilized in order to carry out these assessments. And from the national level, it looks it's messier and less systematic. But in many ways, the national monitoring of learning probably has more of an impact of what goes on in local schools and the kind of practices that teachers practice in the local classrooms and how they're taught and how they're trained, and the kind of pedagogical approaches that they take, in their interactions with students, and the kind of textbooks that are being written. So in my opinion, I mean, all the conditions that are important for student learning are more deeply embodied and reflected in the kind of learning assessments that are going on at the national level, on the one hand. And to the extent that you're involved in trying to produce something that has policy relevance, understanding that level of assessments is also very important, because it has a much greater likelihood of having an impact on schools and school practices, classroom practices, and so on. So I think for me that's one of the important takeaways. I mean, that's one of these areas that need to be given greater attention. And I would hope that they would, consider addressing that in future forum.
Well, I think first of all, I would really like to point out that I think, there were some really, really important issues raised in this forum. I think the issue of, studying how policy convergence happens, how certain issues, travel, how they become dominant, if you will, how they are contextualized, I think those are all very, very important, issues to study. And I think, another issue that's very important and that's maybe not discussed so much. I mean, it was, hinted to, but not discussed in depth, is, the issue of studying up. So the issue of looking at alternatives to these, global policy ideas, looking at patterns of resistance, looking at patterns of alternative education proposals, ideas, and why these specific ideas do not reach the global agenda, if you will. I think, yes, that would be my, and then of course, the consequence of that is methodological as well. So we talked about, studying policy transfer with new institutionalist approaches, or discursive institutionalism, which are all very essential. But just the consequence, of studying issues, patterns of resistance, I think would also be taking a more ethnographic approach, and again, as I said, studying up. Which would be the case I would make, because sometimes we get, we have this idea that these are all the policy options there are, but they're not. I mean, so many countries. The country I know particularly well is Mexico, and if there's anything, it's viable education alternatives, which I would really make a case for studying these alternatives as well.
I think the numbers that are generated by large-scale assessments could be used differently in at least two ways. So I think firstly, different groups of people could be making use of the numbers to those that currently generate the numbers and use the numbers for policy purposes. And I think the second way in which the numbers could be used differently is to generate different kinds of numbers. So I'll say a little bit about both of those. So I think there are some interesting developments happening around the world, and in terms of new groups getting involved in these kinds of assessments, or smaller assessments but the same kind of approaches. So one example would be a group in Toronto called People for Education. It's a parent group that is starting to develop alternative metrics in education, and they're measuring things outside of the normal sorts of cognitive measures or literacy measures. So things like social well-being, citizenship, creativity, and so on. And so what they're interested in doing is drawing policy attention to those issues by actually measuring them. And so I think that's one interesting development, and there's other examples around the world that we could point to as well. Then I think that in a way, I guess that embodies both of them actually. It's a different group of people using the numbers, and they're generating different kinds of numbers. But we're also seeing in assessments like PISA, PIAC, the move to expand what's being assessed. And so we're seeing a move to assess what's being called non-cognitive skills, or sometimes 21st century skills, which is really an umbrella term for a range of different things like student engagement, student motivation, persistence, problem solving, collaborative problem solving, and so on. And I think there's some interesting possibilities there, because it draws attention to a range of other things that schools help students to develop as capacities or competencies. And so it shifts the emphasis away from what's traditionally been measured to a new set of things. And what's perhaps most interesting about that is when we start to measure things like well-being, because what counts as well-being and living a good life varies, and you can only determine that by talking to people about what constitutes a good life for them. So it actually draws people's values into the assessment work in a way that isn't the case when you're measuring things like cognitive skills that have a more standardised conceptual framework and framework for measurement. It actually opens up the debate about what counts and what ought to be counted in a way that perhaps measuring cognitive skills and competencies hasn't done so previously.